over there every year since then. So I do have a rich history of experience over on the Merrimack, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you guys tonight. And again, thank everybody for tuning in. And I also want to let people know that this is going to be more a general information kind of presentation. I've kind of scaled back on the hard science. I'm not going to be throwing complex figures at you guys. So there's a lot of interesting photographs that I think you'll all appreciate. Typically, I try to come up with a humorous anecdote to kind of break the tension, but I'm going to spare you guys of that tonight. And I'm gonna start off with a current event. Now, some of you who are plugged into fish news may have seen this story. This is a lake sturgeon that was captured recently, this past spring, in the Detroit River. And, talk to any biologists and they'll have no shortage of interesting stories about wildlife and their work with wildlife. But very rarely does a story work its way all the way up into, I think this was run in the Washington Post. So it has the perfect storm of ingredients. And, one of those is this massive fish positioned next to a person. And, this again is a lake sturgeon. And as far as sturgeons go, lake sturgeons are not counted amongst the behemoths. But among lake sturgeon, this is an extremely large fish. And I think the article went on to say it's the largest lake sturgeon ever captured, not just by length, but if you look at how girthy that fish is, my experience tells me that this is a late stage mature female just packed with eggs. And I'll bring this point up later, but this portion of the population is critical in carrying forward the population. Males generally are a dime a dozen, and young virgin first-time spawning females, they're not as large. They may not be as competent to succeed at spawning, but these older females are the cream of the crop, and they amongst are rank amongst the members of the population that are the most. So just a little bit of sturgeon history. What is a sturgeon? And they can be described as having this primitive body design. They are shaped pretty much just like a shark. They are incapable of making really tight turns like a sunfish, but they are capable of making very long movements. It's characterized by these 5 rows of bony plates along the side called scutes. And it's believed that these are left over from the ancient armored bony fishes of long ago. One of the most interesting anatomy elements of the sturgeons are its very unique mouth. And I have pulled this mouth out to its fullest extension. It's called a protrusible mouth, and it is capable of allowing the fish to disturb the bottom sediments and look for forage items in the substrate. So we like to call sturgeons a living fossil. And what that simply means is that ancestors of a living species can be found bearing similar characteristics in the fossil record. And it means that that particular animal or animal design, body design, has been very successful. And although these are sturgeon-like fossils, there have actually been more definitive sturgeon fossils found. This one just recently, this was part of a 66 million year old set of fossils that were found, and there were numerous sturgeon bodies together. And I'm just pointing out the unique, this is called a heterocersal tail caudal fin, and there's the anal fin, and here's a pectoral fin. And what this really tells you about the animal is that it's very successful. Nature continued to select it for survival, and it did not have to change much. And this fish, I think the previous slide said that they've been around for about 200 million years. Well, that means this fish has survived several of the global mass extinction events that scientists think that the Earth has endured. So a very successful and resilient species on Earth. There are 26 to 29 known species of sturgeons, and they are all confined to roughly this band of latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. Here in North America, there are 9 separate sturgeon species. I'm going to talk to you today about the short-nosed sturgeon primarily, and I will also talk somewhat about the Atlantic sturgeons. This very colorful and I think well done poster misrepresents the sturgeon sizes, and they range from the smallest, the shovel-nosed sturgeon, adults reach about 2 feet in length, up to the white sturgeon. There's records of them reaching 20 feet. So a huge range of sizes for this successful body design. Sturgeons are what are called a diadromous fish, which means there's some form of their life history requires some sort of migration. Now, anadromy or an anadromous fish, the most familiar probably are salmon, where they live in the ocean and they come into fresh water to spawn. The opposite of that strategy is called catadromy, and an example of that are freshwater eels, American eels, where they live out and mature in fresh water, and then they go to, I believe, the Sargasso Sea to reproduce in mass numbers. Potamodromy is a term that describes a fish that lives its entire life in fresh water. However, it still makes a migration. So the example I have here is a northern pike, but a fish that lives in a lake and then goes into a stream to spawn, like a lake sturgeon, would fit into this category. And amphidromy is a general term that describes a movement between extreme habitats that is not spawning related, such as striped bass pushing upstream in a river to exploit a foraging resource. So just a few notes on their global decline. In around the century culminating in the mid-1800s, a number of insults were afflicted upon sturgeon populations. Of primary issue were migration obstructions. It may be difficult to see in this slide, but all these tiny little black triangles poking up out of the water are lake sturgeon tails. And so they're immediately downstream of an obstruction. And I'm not sure in this photo if this means they're blocked or this is where they would spawn naturally. But nevertheless, sturgeons have the ability to migrate long distances, so they need open migration corridors. And of course, over harvest, here's a picture of Russian sturgeons where when these large fish come into small drainages to find spawning sites, they're very vulnerable to commercial capture. Down here in the lower left, I have a habitat alteration, and this is a shot of the Connecticut River. And just downstream of that spillway flume is the sturgeon spawning, one of the major sturgeon spawning grounds in the Connecticut River. So the females are the primary movers and decision makers of the spawning. So they decide when and where. So a female, when this sluiceway was closed, the habitat could be just right for a female. And she says, I'm going to lay my eggs here, and all the males crowd around her. The egg laying is done. And then an hour or a day later, something like this happens and changes the environment into something the female would not have selected. So habitat alteration, river regulation can be an issue. And also water quality, which is, this along with overharvest, at least in this country, have been two of the areas where we have really made great strides in improving those two conditions. So sturgeon certainly were harvested for their meat, but the primary reason for the interest in sturgeon capture, of course, is the caviar industry. And unfortunately, harvesting the caviar at the right stage is a lethal process. And so right here is a fishery targeted for that very segment of the population that is the most critical to carry on the population, the large gravid females. So talking just about shortnose now, there are currently only 14 remaining populations in North America where there are reproducing populations. And from the St. John River here in Canada down to the Altamaha River in Georgia, this is it. This is the place on Earth where you find short-nosed sturgeons and no place else. Now, just a little bit about, how do we as researchers actually go out and gather information that is useful to those in positions to try and manage and maintain these populations. First, we use a millennia-old technique of gill nets, and sturgeon's behavior and physiology lends itself to this as a viable capture technique, because unlike a salmon or a shad, when a sturgeon is captured in a gill net, it kind of relaxes and it doesn't exhaust itself by fighting the gill net. So we can actually set gill nets overnight in some instances. Using a bit more modern technology, these are telemetry transmitters. I have examples of, radio tags here on the bottom right. You can see the antenna protruding out. And the one without the antenna is an acoustic transmitter, which produces a pulse of sound. And both have their advantages depending upon where you're working and what objectives you are looking for. And I also have an example of an external, mounting the tags externally, as well as doing a surgical procedure, placing a tag internally. Now, as I said before, the reproducing females are the ones that are making all the decisions. So if you want to learn by tagging a fish and tracking it around, what area is important to it, the best animals to tag are the females that are going to spawn. Well, imagine trying to do a surgical procedure on that big lake sturgeon we saw. There's so much pressure and expansion in that bloated cavern of their body containing all the eggs. You really don't want to be doing an incision in there. So we developed the use of fiber optic technology. And so this is called a fiber optic borescope. The tube inside the sturgeon's body through which the eggs pass is translucent. So we found with a light source on the end of this borescope, we could actually look inside the fish without a surgical procedure and actually looking to see if there are eggs inside the fish. And not only can we see the eggs, we can also stage them. So on the lower left is an example of early stage eggs. They're less than a millimeter. They're kind of orangish in color, and they will not be ready for spawning for a few years. So you put a tag in that fish and it's not going to tell you where the spawning ground is, in the next year. The larger eggs on the right are examples of mature late stage eggs, and if there are no ecological impediments, this female will probably go to the spawning site the following spring. And if you don't know where they're spawning, there's a real good chance you can find out by putting a tag. In this case, we usually put those tags externally on the late stage female. And this is our basic sturgeon tracking 101 in our book. The other element that we pursue when we're trying to categorize and identify critical habitat is not only, where do we think spawning's happened, but was spawning successful? So if you don't know where spawning is occurring, this technique is kind of a long shot. But if your tracking tells you, hey, I bet spawning is happening somewhere in this area, well, we've used these modified plankton nets and we anchor them on the bottom, 20, 50 feet or meters downstream of where we think spawning is occurring. And these are actual early life stage samples that we've collected using this technique. And the upper corner here are fertilized eggs. You can actually see the backbone beginning to form. Down here is a hatchling. After about a week to 10 days after being spawned, the free embryo hatches. And you can see that there's no eye, there's no mouth, there's no sensory structures, and this embryo still has some development to go through. So it hides in the rocks, which makes it critical for the female to select the right spawning substrate to allow these photonegative embryos to do so. Then as time passes and the yolk sac gets consumed, you can see the development of eyes. You can see the barbels starting to form here, and better fin folds. And finally, here's a picture of a larva. All the yolk sac is consumed. It now looks like a tiny little sturgeon. It's got all the parts: eyes, mouth, barbels, fins. And although it has some swimming ability, it still can't transport itself downstream 10 kilometers. It has to still rely on the flow of the river to disperse itself downstream to begin feeding on the bottom. Oh, and I have these, this second set of eggs here is an example of, these eggs are probably alive, viable eggs. When they come in contact with water, they become sticky. And so a female chooses a spawning site that has boulder rubble substrate, but it has to kind of be scoured. So there has to be a lot of flow moving over it. So when that sticky egg comes out of the female, it sticks pretty close to where the area that she selected. But if for whatever reason the egg gets coated with sand grains, it'll just keep rolling, and it will roll, far away from the site that the female selected. Just a kind of a quickie summary of sturgeon characteristics. They're ancient fish. They've been on Earth about 200 million years. They can live a long time. There's evidence to suggest that sturgeons some species can exceed 100 years in age. They exhibit anadromy, patadromy, and amphidromy in their behavior and reproductive strategies. They can exhibit extremely long migrations, and this 1,500 kilometers is once the sturgeon has entered a river. So their oceanic movements can be ranged far and wide as well. A wide range of sizes. They generally mature late in life, 10 to 20 years, depending on the species and where in the latitudinal ranges it's found. Infrequent spawning, 2 to 10 year periodicity. Not so much for the males. They can regenerate sperm pretty efficiently, but it takes longer for a female to reproduce a new clutch of eggs, particularly for a large female to reproduce a huge clutch of eggs. There's discrete spawning sites. There's appears to be a limited ability to use alternate sites, but they are colonists, so they have to be able to find other places to spawn. This is just what we've observed. You find a spawning site and they usually return to the same spawning site. And both the sturgeons that I'm going to talk to you about today have both federal and state protected status. So now we're going to focus in a little bit more sharply on the Gulf of Maine, which is where you find the Merrimack. And this is always a crowd pleaser. Sturgeons leap. And unfortunately, unlike a salmon, this leaping ability does not assist them getting up over waterfalls and riffles. So they are kind of the first major waterfall in a river is typically the upstream barrier for that river system. But this is an old document which was published in the 1600s of a traveler who just kind of traveled throughout the land and wrote about what he saw. And the Merrimack is named specifically as a place where the best places in the country to catch sturgeon. And some of these be 12, 14, and 18 feet long. And those, of course, would be Atlantic sturgeons, short-nosed sturgeon. There may be a 4-foot sturgeon on record, but primarily they're 2 and 3 feet long as adults. But because these fish do leap, I've also read accounts that indicate it's dangerous to be in a canoe during the spawning run because you have hundreds, maybe thousands of fish this size, all jacked with hormones and competitive, and it could be hazardous to be in a boat during this time. And there are occasions where a sturgeon will come out of the water in the path of a speedboat, and every now and then there's a report of somebody getting slapped in the face by this ancient bony fish, and it's not pretty. It also makes a note about them falling into boats, and the picture in the lower left is actually a sturgeon that jumped into a boat owned by the Lowell's Boat Shop Museum in Amesbury, Massachusetts. And from that event, we kind of developed a rapport, and I've given a couple presentations, and they've allowed us the use of their docking facilities. So this sturgeon did not die in vain. Now to zoom in a little bit more specifically on the Merrimack study. Again, I did a master's project starting in 1987 through 1990. And this is just the range of this reach of river extends up to the Essex Dam in Lawrence. So a 46-kilometer reach of river. And at the time, you know, the permitting to work with endangered species came from the National Marine Fisheries Service out of NOAA. I was a student at UMass. This state Division of Fisheries and Wildlife allowed me access to keep a camping trailer there. And our agency, which is now USGS, started off as being part of US Fish and Wildlife Service. So a small group of supporters to go back into the Merrimack River and assess the status of sturgeons in that system. And the results of this 4-year period was we set over 11,000 hours of gill nets. Now, that means if you take a 100 meter, that's the length of a football field, gill net and set it for 1 hour, that's 1 hour of gill net effort. So we put a lot of nets in the water, and first few fish we captured, we put tags in them so they would lead us to hopefully where the other sturgeons were. And out of all this effort, we still only captured 24 individuals. And that's frighteningly small for a population of anything. We were able to cobble together with these years of data a defensible mark recapture estimate, which was 32 adults with confidence intervals, up to 79. So, the takeaway message was that back in 1999, there were probably, according to this estimate, less than 100 adults in the Merrimack River. But we did, by setting those egg nets, capture viable reproductive products. So there was a small but still reproducing population, and the spawning site being up here in the vicinity of Haverhill. And then we also identified the summer and fall foraging area, places where they spent the winter, and some interactions and habitat sharing with Atlantic sturgeon. So now fast forward about 20 years, and at that time there was a call for any short-nosed sturgeon genetic tissues because they were looking at doing a range-wide genetic analysis of all the short-nosed sturgeon throughout its range. And because we knew there were a few in the Merrimack, we were given some funding to go over there and try to get a few tissue samples. I've included the Kennebec River here, and you'll see why later. And again, this is the Gulf of Maine, extending kind of bordered by Cape Cod and Nova Scotia. And since this time, our affiliation with other investigating bodies and institutions has really grown, interestingly, to include the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and the Coast Guard, University of New England and University of Maine, states of Massachusetts and Maine. So now this is over an 8-year period. We ended up setting 1,800 hours of gill netting effort, which is, an order of magnitude less than we did previously. And we ended up capturing and tagging over 500 individuals. We were able to do a mark recapture population estimate in the winter of 2009, 2010. And we came away with an estimate of 2,300 adults with confidence intervals. The low end looks supportive, but the high end is extremely kind of out of place. And that's partially due to the fact that we had so few recaptures. The mark recapture estimator we were using was dependent upon generating an estimate based on recaptured individuals. So that's why this confidence interval is so high. But nevertheless, we still identified viable reproduction at Haverhill. But nevertheless, this is an astonishing change in the number of sturgeons that we witnessed. And when we set the first nets in this new effort in April 2008, I set 4 nets at Haverhill, the known spawning site, and we came back and we caught as many fish that next day than we did in 4 years of effort 20 years ago. So something's changed. There was this apparent explosion of new fish joining the population. So we were absolutely ecstatic about being able to follow through with this. So I was during this population estimate, I also caught 30 gravid females, and I had never even seen a female before. So I was all set to go and write a new chapter about sturgeon spawning at Haverhill. Much to my surprise, the females that I tagged, most of them left the Merrimack River the end of March, moved 140 kilometers up the coast and entered the Kennebec River, where they participated in known spawning aggregations in the Kennebec River. And I have the Edwards Dam marked here. That was the first main stem dam on the Kennebec, which blocked short-nosed sturgeon from using this portion of the river until its removal in 1999. So we came along and tagged fish in 2010, some of which occurred up at the most upstream spawning site in the Kennebec, meaning that the sturgeons did then go ahead and use this historic reach of their range, and through the capture of these embryos, demonstrated that there was successful spawning happening here. So over a period of about 8 years, we tagged 24 late stage females with the intent of them showing us where the spawning is happening. And almost 80% of those females left the Merrimack and went up the coast to spawn in the Kennebec, which would then logically lead one to ask, well, of that new surge of individuals appearing in the Merrimack River now, are they truly Merrimack fish, or are they visitors, or I say marauders from the Kennebec? Because if these fish are not spawning and contributing to the Merrimack, they're basically competitors for food resources with the sturgeons that are spawning here. So they may in fact be imposing a threat or a stress to the existing reproducing population. Now, as I said before, sturgeons are known colonists. During the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, all these New England rivers were under ice. The ice sheet went all the way down to Long Island Sound. So after that receded, all these sturgeons had to recolonize all these New England rivers. So we know that colonization is in their nature. So one of the long-term questions we're trying to look at is, are some of these Kennebec females going to end up spawning and contributing to the Merrimack? And this is a longer-term study, and I think it will I'll probably be working on this till I retire and maybe even beyond. Currently, we have about 50 females that have been that are giving us this information, and we now have transmitters that last 10 years. So some of the females were spawning every 3 years, so we're getting repeat behaviors from individuals. But one of the most curious things about all this is we have yet to identify a male to make this coastal run. Now, are you guys still seeing the image, the slideshow?
No.
No.
So it just blanked out?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know how to change that.
Okay. Maybe you could reboot the slideshow.
Okay.
I think if you just share the screen again, I think someone stole it briefly.
Okay.
Yeah. Do that.
Let's see, display show. I don't know how to call up the screen sharing.
It's in the bottom of your screen. It says green, and it sheens share screen. Hit that one.
I don't see that on my screen.
I know when you're sharing your screen, it's kind of tough. You have to.
Does that work? Can you see that? I can see two. It looks to me like the slideshow returned.
I think it's might be only on your screen.
Oh,
So if you move your cursor around, you should see a green box at the bottom that says share screen.
I've seen that box, and I do not see it showing itself at this point. So I've got a tech wizard coming in. Maybe.
Can you minimize your picture?
Maybe minimize your screen and it'll bring up the bar where all those commands are on the bottom.
Yeah, hit exit. Press exit on your keyboard.
Escape.
Escape, I mean, right?
That one.
There you go.
Does that work?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Good.
Sorry for the light show. Okay, so this is everyone's back on board.
Yep.
Okay, so I left off with stating that it's only the females are making this move. That doesn't mean to say that males are not. We just have not identified that yet. And here again is this somewhat precarious and demanding migration, and it happens every year, made by this vulnerable and very critical part of the population, these mature females. So trying to understand what kind of vulnerabilities that this migration may face, I think is of critical importance. And we are in the process of trying to gather as much information about that as we can. So I'm going to move us along. One of the other studies that we recently had the opportunity to participate in was a foraging study where we primarily focused on shortnose sturgeon in the Merrimack River, and other investigators focused on Atlantic sturgeons. Now, these two species of sturgeons are what's called sympatric species, meaning they kind of occupy a very similar ecological niche. And their nature has evolved ways for two apparently competing groups of animals to share the habitat. So in this particular instance, short-nosed sturgeons were found foraging in this portion of the Merrimack River, and their predominant prey species were these small amphipods, about a centimeter in length. And we'd pump their stomachs and they'd spit out 200 of these things, still some of them still swimming around. Whereas the Atlantic sturgeon efforts looked at their stomachs in the same manner, and they were primarily sand lance. So here are two sturgeon species, kind of very similar animals, but behaviorally, they've kind of separated themselves so they're not exploiting each other's food resources, and nature allowing them both to thrive. So this is just, laying hands on some of these large animals is a very exciting experience. And this is gill nets that we've set kind of at the river mouth or just off of the river mouth. And these are early adults, some of them subadults, but larger Atlantic sturgeons. And in fact, I had to reconfigure my boat to be able to handle these larger fish. So we also spent some time looking at the winter ecology of short-nosed sturgeon, and boating in the teeth of winter in the middle of February is absolutely delightful, particularly when you have a crew person that can find joy in just about anything. The truth, this is one of our volunteers, the truth of the matter is she's smiling because she knows she's on the way to the truck's heater. But we used just a common underwater video camera and suspended it over what we came to understand were these wintering aggregations. And this is an image taken in the Connecticut River. And sturgeons severely reduce their feeding. They find a suitable flow, and they just kind of stack right next to one another for a 4 to 5 month period. And it's probably an energy conserving behavior. And then when the water warms up again, they start to feed and they go to their spawning sites. Right now on the Merrimack, there are a number of ongoing and planned bridge reconstruction efforts. And so the Mass Department of Transportation hired some consulting efforts to get a better understanding about sturgeons wintering and spawning in close proximity to the work sites. And they were able to throw at it some really high-tech hydroacoustic or side scan sonar equipment. Now, this is an image, kind of a zoomed in image of a group of sturgeon detected by the side scan sonar. And the black part that you see here is actually an acoustic shadow, but it provides an astonishing profile of the fish, which shows without any reservation that these are a group of sturgeons. The actual image of the fish is this lighter portion right here, and from which you really can't identify the fish to species, but this shadow is very helpful. Now, if we back out of this image, you can get an idea. These are all sturgeons. And this is this is what we've seen with the camera and what other scientists have reported. This is a typical wintering aggregation of sturgeons. And this is right in the Merrimack River. And their estimates, they were able to use, computer technology and image analyses, and they came up with over 3,700 individuals, which I think fits pretty nicely in with our mark recapture estimate. And the company that I've been in communication with, Stantec, has been tasked with trying to learn as much as possible about the sturgeons in relationship to the bridge constructions. Steel Associates was the group that actually had the side scan sonar technology, and the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, is making it all happen. So those are, kind of a taste of the kind of things that we're trying to provide. We're researchers, and we're not the ones who make management decisions. So the information that we choose to pursue, and many times, we try to understand what managers are looking for and can make use of. So for in the instance of identifying these winter sites, well, what if somebody wanted to, put in a pipeline or dredge a marina or a ship channel, or a rail car, rolls off the tracks and dumps a noxious chemical into the river. This is kind of a vulnerable period for sturgeons. They're all in one spot. They're all kind of sedentary. So knowing where those are is very useful for people whose jobs it is to manage the resource. So one of my favorite parts of this work is spreading the word, forming partnerships. And this is an example of work we're doing on the Piscataqua. There's a representative here from NOAA, the National Marine Fishery Service, because there is a proposal to to dredge a huge chunk of the river out to make a commercial shipping turning basin. And so they were interested in, our sturgeons spending any time here. Is an important habitat for sturgeons. And the man to my left in this photograph is a representative of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And they refuel nuclear submarines at this base, and they build ships, repair ships, and they have huge dry docks. So sturgeons could easily be entrained in those dry docks, and now we've got a protected species we've got to handle. So, they've been interested in the goings on of sturgeons in the Piscataqua River. We have contributed information to a program that was established some years ago called the SCUTES program. And I have to read this each time. It stands for Students Collaborating to Undertake Tracking Efforts for Sturgeons. So it's a sturgeon lesson curriculum designed for elementary, middle, and high school age groups. All right, if you want to know more about this program, you would contact the National Marine Fishery Service or go to their website. They've got coloring books and teaching materials, so you can conceivably carry this to your own school. I'm also part of a carcass recovery network. Because sturgeons are protected, you can't just go out and collect a few and chop them up to learn more about their anatomy or what's the best way to drill a hole through them to attach a tag. So the fish up in the sand here, this was a fish that washed up on Cape Cod, and we walked out on the beach for a mile or two during one of the coldest Februaries I have ever experienced. And here in the reeds is a 6-foot Atlantic sturgeon with a very obvious lethal gash in its head. And it's speculated that this is probably a large vessel propeller strike. And so because of my interaction with the Lowell's Boat Shop Museum, their representative, Graham McKay, came down and helped me pull this thing up and out of the water. And on the way back to the shop, he said, Micah, we have a group of students out on the river right now. How about we take this sturgeon and run upriver and show it to them? So I was able to put together an impromptu sturgeon lesson for the people or the kids here camping out or hanging out on this island. When I was on Cape Cod, I took the opportunity to share sturgeon information with the National Park Service rangers. This is in a small Atlantic that we caught in the Merrimack. And this is our last technician, Riley Jones, who is showing the sturgeon to a family. And we'll go out of our way to try and find if there's anybody within shouting distance when we have sturgeon on the boat, we'll usually try to make a run to invite them to come and see the sturgeon. And this is Sarah Hilton. She was the graduate student doing the foraging study. And we're all standing on the Lowell's Boat Shop Museum's dock. And she's showing a short-nosed sturgeon to a group assembled on the dock. So I did not come up with this logo. It seemed appropriate at the time I heard it, but they truly are an astonishing species, and they have survived countless insults, but all sturgeon species on the globe are in decline, some of them critically, some are being managed very well. But it is our job as researchers to try and understand what's possible to collect and what's going to be of value to collect. And so we're in routine communication with managers, both state and federal, and interact with universities and take advantage of education opportunities as we can. So that's my story. And again, I thank everybody for tuning in.
Micah, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. So much information I had never heard before. And I'm thinking perhaps a lot of people here haven't heard this. So thank you so much. We've got a ton of questions. I want to see if we can get through as many as we can here.
Okay.
Ready? Okay, I'm going to rapid fire you here. Here's the first one. How deep is the Merrimack at the wintering sites?
We were practicing with a protocol antenna that we're trying to develop to maybe be able to read pit tags, which is a small passive integrated transponder tag we put in all sturgeons. I didn't show it to you, but it's like the speed pass at the gas pump. And we were in 10 to 15 feet of water. So it's not so much the depth that they're selecting as it is the flow. It always seems to flesh out that the right flow is the flow that creates a sandy substrate. If it's rocky, that means the flow is probably a little bit too swift. And remember, they're not feeding, so they can't be spending a lot of energy trying to hold their position. And if it's too slow, then they can stir up clouds of mud and muck. And now they've got all that's got to get blown through their lungs. Their gills. So this sand, seems to be, it's not too swift and it's not too slow. It's, just right. And I think it's the flow that they're pursuing, not necessarily the sand. The sand is an artifact of depositions made by the flows they're selecting.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that question was from Paulina Schwartz. Next question is from Andy Blanchard, and he asks, do Kennebec spawning sturgeons winter over in the Kennebec as well?
Yes, there is, until my first few sturgeons carried tags from the Merrimack to the Kennebec, they were believed to be two separate populations, maybe marginally interacting as a wandering species might. At the time when these recent studies began in the Kennebec, they also found a similar situation with the Penobscot River, where there are sturgeons living and wintering in the Penobscot, but so far there has not been any documentation of spawning. So it looks like, they're just a bedroom community for the Kennebec. So there's no spawning occurring in the Penobscot, which I believe historically there used to be, but there's a series of dams on that river too. So they are joining the Kennebec River population, which as far as the Gulf of Maine goes, at least the United States part of it, is the largest short-nosed sturgeon population in the Gulf of Maine. I think the population in the St. John is fairly large as well. But yeah, the Kennebec has its own population. And again, until recently, we didn't know how much interbasin movement there was. And it turns out there's quite a bit. And I brought up the idea of them removing the Edwards Dam with the idea that, well, perhaps that created situations in the Kennebec that was very conducive to a population growth, such that the competition for foraging became such that there were groups of sturgeons that moved out of the Kennebec to find foraging in the neighboring rivers, which happened to be the Kennebec and the Penobscot.
Right. Next question is from Tim Brush. And the question is, do you know what gear Steel Associates used for those images?
Oh, it's called an Edge Tech, and there's a number associated with it. I think it's something like, I couldn't begin to guess what the number is. I can make that available to the Watershed Council for posting if you want to do that, or you can contact, Steel Associates directly, or Stantec, or even Mass DOT. I know that the researchers on the Kennebec, Gail Whipplehauser and her group have a unit like that. It's a EdgeTech 4025 or something like that. But it's as far as ocean surveying equipment goes, it's affordable. I think it's only what, $40,000 now. But it's very, very powerful. The earlier side scan sonar units, it was difficult to separate a fish that was resting on the bottom from the bottom, but you can see with this technology, at least for sturgeons, they stand out very clearly.
Okay. All right. Next question is from Eric Hutchins, and the question is, have you completed any gut content analysis during the spring herring migrations? Wondering if there's any evidence that Atlantics ever eat river herring.
I'm unaware of any instances of prey being found of herring prey being found in shortnose or Atlantics. If you look at the mouths of the sturgeon relative to their body size, they have a proportionally pretty tiny mouth. Now, that's not to say that sturgeons wouldn't take, a dead herring or a herring that's kind of in pieces. Whether or not they could chase down a herring and swallow it, I think there's some evidence to suggest that larger sturgeons are capable of this. Atlantics are certainly capable of pulling sand lance out of the sand and swallowing them. So, but I'm not familiar with any instances of herring being selected as a prey item.
Okay. Next question from Jacqueline Burns. What are the bony plates made of? Is it all cartilaginous? I'm sorry, I'm not.
Cartilaginous?
Thank you. Yeah.
Interesting. I did mean to bring this up. What's unique about the sturgeon skeleton structure is that it is mostly cartilage. Just the head and pectoral girdle are bone. Everything else is cartilage. The scutes are, I'm sorry, I would have to refer to someone more knowledgeable than I. I was at a conference in Canada some years ago, and there was a craftsman selling what he called sturgeon ivory. And he made the case that the scutes are similar in chemical composition to ivory. I don't really know how authentic that is, but he sculpted them into very interesting brooches and necklaces, and that's about all I can say about it. They're not bone, but they are nourished, so it's not a dense material. It's kind of honeycombed, and I'm just going to continue to give you what ifs if I keep talking. So I guess I'll end it there.
Okay. We have more questions. Here's another one from Don McGinley. I know that a US Fish and Wildlife Service herring survey crew mistakenly gill netted Atlantic sturgeon in the Connecticut about a week ago. The fish easily rolled out of the net to freedom. Do you know of any details about this netted sturgeon?
This is the first I have heard of it, but I certainly am not surprised that sturgeons get caught in any kind of netting that's set out. Even if, we select gill nets with a mesh size conducive to, doing what a gill net's supposed to do, which is slide over the head and get behind the gills. So when the fish tries to back out, the gill net strands go inside the operculums, and hence, the fish gets gill netted. But because of their bony scutes, a sturgeon can roll into a net of very small mesh, can't even fit its snout into the mesh, and still get entangled by it. As I mentioned before, their behavior is such that they don't always necessarily thrash to the last ounce of their fiber to escape an entanglement. They seem to be able to take that a little bit more in stride. And it's the description of the sturgeon just rolling out of the net. We certainly have seen that as well. They can get caught by a net just on a few tines of their scutes, and they in some instances anyway, seem to be okay with that. But that is, I know that there are numerous efforts at the moment to capture fish of sturgeons, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service's herring survey. So, but my teleworking computer is given up the ghost, so I'm seeing my email once every other day.
All right. One other question from Nicholas Anderson. Do you know of sturgeon moving through the fishways and using habitat above the dams on the Merrimack?
There is no evidence to suggest that that is currently happening. I did a little bit of investigation of some documents from archaeologists who were examining Indian fishing camp remains just downstream of the Amoskeag Falls in Manchester, what is now Manchester, New Hampshire, and they did find sturgeon remains there. So the behavioral site is about 30 kilometers upriver, which is really short distance for a spawning site. So the speculation is that that's a remnant population, maybe came from a different river, that there's a good chance that the Amoskeag Falls area was the historic, or one of the historic spawning sites for sturgeons in the Merrimack. Now, interestingly, I've been working on the Connecticut River for some time, and it was thought that, sturgeons, the Great Falls, which is the barrier in Turner's Falls, was such that sturgeons were not able to get up over it. And so it was, assumed that that was the natural boundary for sturgeons. Well, in 2017, an angler caught a sturgeon below the Vernon Dam, which is above the Turner's Falls Dam. And so the question is, well, how'd that fish get up there? And through some more investigation, I came to terms with the fact that between the late 1700s and mid 1800s, there was a barge canal system to get commercial traffic up over the Turner's Falls Dam. Now, we know sturgeons will use canals. We know they will use locks. And so there was basically a 60-year open door to allow sturgeon to continue moving farther upstream in the Connecticut River. And it wasn't until I went up there and actually started looking around after this angler capture. And I try to talk to as many people as I can when I'm in the field. And there were numerous people who believed that they'd seen sturgeons up there. So just because the local information is there doesn't mean it necessarily gets downstream. So I do plan definitely to take my camera and my boat into the Merrimack River and launch, upstream of the Lawrence and Lowell dams, just to have a looky-loo. And right now there is technology to, if some of you have maybe heard about the environmental DNA, and there may be some justification to conduct an environmental DNA sampling up there, although we have explored that technique. And if the numbers are really low, it's difficult to expect much from an effort like that. But we will have a look around, but there is no current evidence to suggest there's sturgeons upstream of Lawrence.
Okay, great.
And-
Another
and-
question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay. This is somewhat related to that. It's from Don McGinley. He's noting that he's aware of short noses in the Haverhill area for years. His question is, why don't these fish in Atlantics migrate up near to the Essex Dam? Is the problem the long, low water, rocky area in the river towards Methuen?
That's certainly a reasonable speculation about. I mean, we've wondered that too. You know, from Haverhill all the way up to the dam, there appears to be, you know, numerous places where this rock and rubble substrate exists, but it doesn't take long once the spring freshet starts to drop that there's very little flow up in those reaches, and it may very well be that sturgeons were able to detect that, you know, this is not the appropriate flow, maybe because of the, you know, how well the rocks are scoured or not. It may be left over from, if this is a remnant of a visiting a group of sturgeon that visited, for instance, like the Androscoggin, where they're spawning about 30 kilometers from the river mouth. They may be genetically hardwired to, you know, no, we only go upstream this far. And people we have set nets upstream in that area, and we've performed, you know, years of tracking, and we just see very little evidence of sturgeons going much farther beyond, you know, that big hairpin turn just upstream of Haverhill.
Okay, I have one more question here. And this is sort of related to what you just were answering, but this is also from Eric Hutchins, and he asks, if spawning is the limiting factor, do you have any thoughts of assisting to get sturgeon further upstream of the Merrimack? I presume he means maybe the dams.
Based on the information that we have at the moment, I'm not sure what could be done to entice sturgeons to move farther upstream. You know, it looks like, you know, you could spend a lot of money on trying to craft a fishway suitable for sturgeon, and there is an elevator at the Lawrence Dam, but there was an elevator at Holyoke for many years that seemed, you know, few sturgeon chose to use it until there were some modifications made around 2015, and after which, you know, there was an exponential jump in the number of sturgeons being able to get into the elevator. But in the case of the Connecticut, you know, we would see in some years 100 or 200 sturgeons, you know, immediately downstream of the dam, just appearing to, you know, they're either here to spawn or they're here because they can't get upstream any farther. And we don't see anything similar on the Merrimack. So, you know, you could spend money to create a doorway up there, but if nobody's knocking on it, I don't know how you would necessarily entice those fish to move on.
All right. Well, that's the end of our questions here. We have a bunch of comments and appreciations and congrats in the chats here, and I'll share them with you, Micah, later.
Okay.
But thank you so much for this presentation. This is
my pleasure.
Audience, thank you so much for attending, and we'll be doing more presentations in the future. Just please keep an eye out on Facebook and our website, and we'll be bringing more presentations like this to you. So thanks again.
Thank you.